Good evening and welcome to the Johns Hopkins University Writing Webinar, Craft the Story of Your Technical Work, led by Dr. Austin Tremblay. JHU offers free writing webinars to engineering for professional students once a semester. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Austin Tremblay. Austin was born and raised in North Carolina. He holds a doctorate from the University of Houston, an MFA from New Mexico State University, and attended UNC Pembroke for undergraduate studies. His writing has appeared in Gulf Coast, Smartish Pace, New South, and other fine publications. When he isn't working, Austin enjoys tennis, spontaneous camping trips, and cooking with his wife. His success is a testament to that of his teachers. Currently, he's a local to Southern California. Austin, thanks so much for being with us this evening. Please begin.
Thank you so much, Haley. It's absolutely my pleasure to talk with y'all about crafting the story of your technical work. And I'm so delighted to be able to talk with y'all about this. It's something I'm super passionate about. And so I hope that this will be a fun time for us tonight and a practical one. I am going to present some content, but I also hope that we can make this a little interactive. I know the webinar format is less so just because we can't necessarily see each other, but I'm excited to get your input, and I'm going to ask for your input several times throughout the session. And I'm a pretty laid back person, so please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this talk. So I'd be delighted if you have things you're curious about and you want to ask about at the end. But I'm going to start off by launching a poll for us. And the poll is super simple. It's just one question. And what I'm curious about is, if I say the words Ben Franklin and electricity, I'm curious what you think of these choices. What would you think of? What's your association when I say Ben Franklin and electricity? And I see awesome results coming in. I see lots of people participating. That's super cool. It's always fun to watch these come in. We'll leave this up for a little bit longer. We're almost at 80% participation. Can we get to 80%? We're so close. All right. So definitely my association. All right, we made it, 81% now. So definitely my association with this, and what I expect your association is a key attached to a kite. And that's because we have been told a story about the invention or the discovery rather of electricity. That's a story that we've been told. And the reason that it's so memorable is because it uses lots of devices and lots of tools that storytelling uses. It uses image. We have the image of a character, and we have the image of a key tied to one end of a kite, and he's running down the street and flying a kite, and we have the image of the lightning storm. We have the tension of the storm brewing, and then the the uncertainty of what's going to happen, and then we have the main action that takes place in the story. We have so many elements of story, and that makes it super memorable. And so I want to talk about how we can borrow some of those devices from storytelling and apply them to our technical work, because I think that they will be super useful if we can do that. So, and if you're just curious, I'll share these results real quick. So 88% of us were at this key attached to a kite. I do want to know about these 4 people with chutes and ladders. That sounds like a really interesting story too. But I think this is our main association, and it really is driven by storytelling. We've been told this story, especially if you grew up and went to public school in this country, you definitely experienced that. So I'm going to go ahead and move us forward here, and we can look at why storytelling is an important part of science. And this quote to me really nails it. So science is about storytelling, expectations, and plot reversal as much as it is about any particular facts. I love this quote because it really recognizes the importance of storytelling in scientific or data-driven work. And so I want us to think about this evening during our time together 2 questions. The first is, how can we utilize the tools of storytelling to write engagingly about data-driven research? In other words, how can we borrow all of those devices from storytelling to write really entertaining stories that help us achieve successful results? And the second is, how can we bring our own lens to our science-based storytelling? So those are the 2 questions I really want us to focus on tonight, and or this morning in the case of our friend joining from Australia. So before we can think about those 2 things, though, we really have to think about, if we're saying storytelling is important and we can apply these things, these tools from storytelling in our work, in our scientific work, we really have to figure out what a story is exactly. What makes a story, and why is it a valuable thing for us to unpack? So let's look a little bit at how stories are made up. So we tend to think of stories as these kind of epic, large pieces, right? These big entities, but really they have a pretty crude anatomy when we get down to the sort of nitty-gritty details. And really, if we think about it, the most basic sentence is a story. I tripped is a story. We won is a story. I quit is sometimes a very fascinating story, sometimes that you just want to tell yourself, right? They're all stories. Granted, there's a lot of implied information in these stories, but each one of those sentences is a story. It's communicating a lot of information. And so I want to think about how to take what's happening in even those basic sentences and squeeze all the valuable stuff out of it that we can apply to our more technical work. And one of the best ways to think about how we can write stories, how we can craft stories, is to think about the inherent shape that they have. Stories really have an inherent shape or an inherent structure. And I'll prove that to you right now. If you would, in the chat, I'm curious if you'll just throw in the chat real quick. If I say something like a 3-act structure, or if I say what a rising action and a climax and those sorts of things, I'm curious what it makes you think of. I'm just curious what words it makes you think of if I say, a movie has a 3-act structure. What does that make you think of? I'm just super curious to hear your thoughts on that. Theater, for sure, absolutely. Main components. And then I noticed Bryant, I think, pointed out, beginning, middle, and end. And those are the exact terms that I'm thinking of. There's no right or wrong answer to this. But that beginning, middle, and end of the 3-act structure, the basic 3-act structure of a story, is exactly what I'm thinking of when I say a shape. So if a story has a shape, we already recognize many of the most common ones. And here's another example of a very common one that we can utilize in our own work. So we have this beginning, right? And for prose writers or even a screenwriter or a playwright, I saw people saying theater. We think about the beginning often as a problem, but in STEM, and I feel like I have some license to talk about STEM. My degrees are all in the humanities. I concede that. But I work with engineers here at Whiting full time. I support engineering faculty and students, and I'm married to a neuroscientist. So I get to claim some credit. I'm like science adjacent. So in STEM, I think that we often think of that problem as a question, a research question. And I'm talking about, very simple, basic stuff here. And so this beginning is really in a story structure, that inciting moment that justifies the action that you're going to take. In other words, why is it important, this work you're going to do? Why is this very important work? What's vital about this work? And then when we get to the middle, there's action taken. So, we start with this question, but then we have to take some action. Things further develop. We make reports, right? These are all sort of component parts of the middle. So here's where all our data ends up. And that data really needs to be qualified. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what I want to take from this right now is that this is where that data is really located in the structure of our technical stories. When we talk about our technical work, in the middle is really where those data are going to fit. And then we have the ending, the third part of that structure. And that's where the action subsides and then a conclusion is made. Something shifts, something changes. Now, in a story, it could be, a creative story. It could be that a character experiences a life change and they have a shift in their perspective. They feel very differently about something. But often when we're talking about our technical work, our understanding is what shifts. The audience's understanding of the problem that we talked about and we addressed in the beginning, that we said the project was going to address. That's often what the change is that we experience. And so now you get to, if I can move this bar, sorry. Now you get to tell us about your successful project, and you get to answer my favorite research question, which is, so what? You told us what the problem was, you told us data, and you qualified it, you contextualized it. And now what? What's the larger implication of that? That's my absolute favorite question, because it addresses not only the project itself, but how that project fits into the larger scope of things. So I always get excited about these endings because they get us into a place where we can talk about the large scale of our project. And here's a little cheat code that I use to think about this story structure. And it was given to me by a mentor of mine, an amazing screenwriter and playwright named Mark Medoff. And he used to say, all right, you've got a question mark, an exclamation point, and a period. The question mark, what's going to happen? What's the work that's being done? What will happen? Who's going to do it? All of those sorts of questions fit into that first piece. And then the exclamation, action happens. So in a story, we often say the worst thing possible happens. The highest stakes thing happens. In technical work, a very important, vital thing happens, and a very thorough piece of research happens, and we present a lot of data about it, and then we get to that resolution, the period, the end, where now something has shifted and everything sort of subsides, and we can think about the larger implication. So this is the way that I always think about this structure, these 3 punctuation marks. It's so simple, right? But if you start to unpack stories, and even just you're watching a movie and you think, oh, what is the 3-act structure of this? I guarantee you, if you start to apply this as a lens to those stories, you'll find a lot of echoes of the structure. So here's another way that we can think about story shape, and we can think about especially constructing our beginnings. I want this to be as practical for you as possible. And so I want to think about each of those 3 pieces. And so if we think about that beginning section, the question mark section, there's this great book called Making Shapely Fiction by this guy named Jerome Stern. And he describes this idea or this story shape called bear at the door. And it's sort of a strange name for it. When I first encountered it, I was like, what does that mean? And I have a nice ferocious bear here. And in the bear at the door shape of a story, this is what Stern says. All right, you write a story in which your character has a problem. So Henry, there's a bear at the door, right? That's the first thing. There's a problem. What is the question? What is the research we're going to undertake? What is the problem the research is going to address? But the problem's got to be significant. Henry is huge. There's a bear at the door, but it's also a really big bear. So if the problem that we're undertaking is not significant, if it's not a huge problem, then it becomes less interesting to, especially to a general audience, but even to a super technical audience, like funders for grants. They're very interested in, huge, sexy projects as well. So we have to think about the importance of and the scale of our problem. And then the problem should be pressing. Henry, I think, is trying to get in. It's got to be urgent, right? It's got to be a relevant, urgent thing that we're addressing. If we're trying to address a problem that's dated or that's already been resolved through other research and through other work, it's not going to be nearly as exciting as if the problem is super, super urgent. So when you're looking at, okay, I'm going to design my research project, and now I'm going to think about the beginning section of that, like how I construct it, how I design it, and how I think about writing about that research project, I would ask these 3 questions. Is there a problem that is existing and being addressed? Is it a large problem, a significant problem? Is it a problem that is urgent? And as I say here, beginnings need to really push us forward. They need to move us forward so that we can get to that middle section, right, where we have the meat and potatoes data that we can look at. So your research question ideally is pretty simple. It's easy to understand, but we should definitely understand how it's vital and understand its import, understand how important it is. And often in STEM, this gets called significance, right? We think about, the importance as significance. So that's one way of thinking about our beginnings. And I wanted to just point out a nice exemplary opening that someone put together here. This is quoted in a really fantastic book by Joshua Schimmel called Writing Science, and I recommend you pick up that book. But this is a great opening. Conjugated polymers are novel materials that combine the optoelectronic properties of semiconductors with the mechanical properties and process advantages of plastics. Thus, conjugated polymers offer the possibility for use in devices such as plastic LEDs, photovoltaics, transistors, and in completely new applications such as flexible displays. What is this doing? It's providing an interesting contrast between two things that are already known. It's saying, here's something that exists, and here's a situation that we're going to undertake, and we're going to look at with this project. Here's the larger framework of the project. And it also makes an exciting claim at the end in that last sentence about new applications. And flexible displays is something that gets my attention. So it does all of those things. So that's an example of one that I think works really well. But then when we get to the middle and we think about our data, one big thing that we really have to come to terms with when we're writing about technical materials, that data alone cannot tell our story. Without context, data, it might have some inherent value, but it's really tough, and it's really hard on audiences to accept. And so I just made this little meme here with data. I'm a Star Trek nerd, and so I just made this little joke. You have to be careful not to, just rely on very technical data and super technical language. If you rely on that too heavily, it's not going to be super engaging when you write about it. And so interpretation really is the way you sort of steer your projects. I often think about the metaphor of a car. And when I'm thinking about writing, I think about this metaphor a lot. And when I think about data, I think it's an apt metaphor. You've got so many component parts in a car. You've even got the engine, right? Data can be all of those. It can be the fuel filter. It can be the engine. It can be the gas pedal, whatever it is, those little component parts. But without a steering wheel, it's very difficult to get anywhere. The car can move, but it's hard to get where we need to go. So interpretation or contextualization of the data is really how you're going to steer the project. And I encourage you to contextualize data for that reason. I mentioned Joshua Schimmel's book, and this is a great quote of his. Our ultimate goal is not those data we collect, it is the understanding we derive from them. In other words, it's the interpretation that we get from them. So think about, as you're putting together your writing, what is the context that I can provide about this? What relationships between the data, among the data, can you highlight? That's a nice question for you to ask. And here's a nice middle section. I'm just checking the time to make sure we're doing okay there. So this is a section that's or a passage that's about tornadoes and addressing the idea that there's causation between lower income neighborhoods and tornadoes. So in an effort to better grasp where exactly tornadoes tend to touch down, Purdue researchers concluded that twisters have a statistical preference for causing the most damage in so-called transition zones, geographic areas where two distinct types of landscapes meet and dramatically change. More often than not, these sparsely developed, lowly populated outskirts are where mobile home communities can be found in the greatest numbers. And they provide a little bit of quantitative data here, if I can get my slide deck to cooperate. So they provide this quantitative data, but they don't just provide it and move on. They provide it and offer some context that, in other words, primo areas for mobile home settlements, primo areas where that's been developed for that specific use are where statistically tornadoes are prominent. So what this does is it demystifies this long-held belief that there's causation between trailer parks and tornadoes, right? We know that that's ridiculous, but it demystifies that by contextualizing the quantitative data that it presents. It also explains the correlation that's so often noted. It says, look, there is correlation here, but I can tell you why. And it helps steer us, remember our car metaphor, towards an understanding of what that data means. So I really appreciate that about this middle section. So endings, then, that last section, this is, to me, the frame job where you really, really say, how can I contextualize this in a larger frame? Not only just contextualizing my data, but what does it mean to say that I arrived at these results? And as Schimmel points out, a good resolution shows us how our understanding has advanced by offering new insights into the problem identified in the opening. It wraps up the story. So how can you couch your question, your data, your results, your discussion, everything in the argument that you're presenting? How can you couch that in a larger frame of reference? Or as I pointed out earlier, so what? How do you answer that so what question? What is it that gets at that larger framework? This is a great quote that I really like about endings, if it will move there. The writer has done his job when the reader's reaction to the ending is, oh my God, followed by, of course. And the reason for that is that stories, they operate in the spiral structure where they move forward, right? Every good story is moving us forward, 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 but it reverberates back and folds back onto itself. It starts reiterating the main points that it wants to make. So as it's moving forward, it's also spiraling back to reiterate these things. And so by the time an audience gets to the end of a really successful piece of writing, they say, oh yeah, I totally saw that coming. Yeah, I knew that. Wait. No, I'm surprised by that. But yeah, I did see it coming. But I'm really right. We have this simultaneous epiphany, and we feel like, oh yeah, definitely I was prepared for that. So if we can do that in our writing, we can be super, super successful. So these are the three pieces of that 3-act structure, that beginning, middle, and end. And again, our questions, right? How can we use these tools, narrative arc, story structures, shapes, tension, to create more engaging research reports and presentations? And how can we bring our own lens to our science-based storytelling? So those are the things, right? Just like a good story, I want to fold back. I want that spiral shape and say, these are the questions that I'm interested in entertaining for us tonight. So hopefully we have a sense of some answers to the first one there. And now I want to think about how we can bring to bear our own experience and our own interests when we're dealing with super technical writing. And to do that, I'm going to ask you to participate in a little writing exercise with me. I hope you're down for that. I hope you're down for being a little bit creative. So I don't know if y'all will be familiar with this or not, but it's one of my favorite little genres to think about. Ernest Hemingway famously said he was like in a bar drinking with his friends, and he said, I can write a really compelling story in 6 words. And everybody was like, no, you can. And he said, yeah, I totally can. And maybe this story is apocryphal. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. But he said, I'll prove it. And supposedly he wrote this on a napkin. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. An incredibly poignant story in 6 words. Whether it happened or not, at least it caused a lot of writers to challenge themselves with extreme concision, with how concise can I be? And so in that spirit, I want us to challenge ourselves. And what I'd love to do, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second, and I'm going to grab this link that I'm going to drop in the chat. And this link is just to a Jamboard. It's just to a collaborative whiteboard. And then I'm going to also share that so that we can all look at it together. But I invite you to just copy and paste that. And what I want to do is I want you to take a look at some of these examples of 6-word stories or 6-word memoirs that people came up with. I think these are super clever, and they're very fun for me to think about how we're challenged by limitation. And what I'd love for you to do is to take, say, 5 minutes or so, and I would love for you to just create a sticky note over here and write your own 6-word story. I would love for you to write whatever comes to mind. But I'll do an example here. I'm totally, stealing this from Julie Caesar, right? But this would be, one of those. So just create a little 6-word story. Take a few minutes, create a sticky note. It's over here. And you can put your name in it. Nobody's going to judge you. And you don't have to put your name in it either if you don't want to. But I would love to see if at least a few sticky notes show up here. So I'll time you for 5 minutes. Take just a couple minutes and think through 6 words. Tell us a little story. And I'll mute myself so that I'm not too distracting here. Y'all are awesome. You're producing very quickly. This is great to see. Keep them coming. Feel free to move stuff around too if you want. Totally your space. I love these. These are fantastic. These are so fantastic. These are great. Y'all are making my day right now by doing this. Thank you so much for indulging me in this. I want to make sure I give you the time I said I would. So we'll take another minute or so. Oh, these are great. I love these so much. So here's why I'm asking you to do this. Okay. Having to compress an entire narrative, an entire story down into a small piece forces us to do some interpretation. We have to think about the scope of the entirety of the story, and then we have to say what is essential, what is absolutely essential, what is the most crucial information that we need to contain in this, and that's it. Everything else goes, right? And that is the exercise of contextualizing data, essentially. That is, not to suggest it's simplistic, but that way of saying, all right, this is the most crucial information, and here's how I'm going to shape it into what I want an audience to get out of it. That is the interpretive steering that I'm encouraging you to do when you put together your data and you take your quantitative data and you qualify it in whatever way you help an audience understand. So I love that more of these are coming in. I hope that you'll continue to create these. And I think these are so fun and entertaining because it gives us a chance to see how we are challenged by the concision aspect of it, right? We have to be super concise, but again, we make that interpretive move where we say, here's what's crucial, here's what I'm going to retain, and this is the way I want to move forward in order to steer the story so that we get to a destination. So let me check the time. I think it's appropriate at this point, if anybody has questions, I would absolutely love to answer your questions. I'd be so delighted to answer questions. And we have two ways that you can answer questions or ask questions. You can pose them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you and let you unmute and ask your question on mic. So whichever you would be more comfortable with. I'm going to stop sharing this, although I love looking at all these sticky notes. And this will be available to you, or you can screenshot it too if you'd like to keep this. But I'm going to stop sharing for now, just so we can have a more of a conversation. So if folks want to raise their hand or pose something in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions. And I see Bryant put something in the Q&A, but also has a hand raised. So I will allow you to talk, Bryant, and you can come off mic and pose your question if you'd like.
All right, thanks for the opportunity, Austin. Great event, once again, great event, and thank you for the meaningful information. And it resonated with me a lot because just as an engineer or scientist, you're so used to just reaching for that rubric, right? When you go to write that paper, there's this clear write this, write this, write this, and it's almost muscle memory. So my question was, if you had a rubric, it seems like you're more not so much like step one, step two, all the way to step six. What would your rubric be? What would be the 6 things that you would put on there? Some of the things I saw were like a cool quote, some context. What would your grading rubric be if you had one?
That's a great question. You know, I think what you're getting at with that is that in writing, there's a lot of room to sort of be improvisational. And a lot of times we start writing something and then midstream we have to shift. And so there's this great E.L. Doctorow quote that I think about a lot where he says, writing is a lot like driving at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but that's as far as you need to see. You don't need to see the destination when you start. So I think often what happens is writers, whether they be researchers or creative writers, and I really don't like creative writers because anybody who's writing is creative, but that's how we refer to people in my field. But whether it's a researcher, a novelist, whoever it is, we can sometimes write ourselves into a trap by saying, "Oh, it's gotta end this way. The results are gonna be this," or I know how this experiment is gonna go, and we have to really be careful about setting up those sorts of expectations and writing towards something. And I would encourage you, to think about how you can allow yourself some freedom to improvise if needed, and where appropriate. Obviously, there are some conventions of the genre. There are some conventions of, a report that we need to like have these certain pieces. And if I'm a reviewer, I'm looking for these certain pieces. We have to meet those demands sometimes. But how can we allow ourselves a little bit of freedom within that? So I think that's something that I'm looking for when I'm reviewing writing, whether it's a more formal grant proposal or a story or a poem or something.
I understand, and I won't hold you because I know there's other people that want to ask questions, but I've written a couple white papers. I'd like to send them to you and get your opinion, because I try to hold true to that as far as like having media, having artwork, telling a full story, where we don't see that so much in technical writing.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. I'd be happy to. I have a very large fee. I'm totally kidding. I'm totally kidding. Yes, please reach out to me. I'm very findable in the Hopkins universe. So please reach out to me, and I'd be happy to give you some feedback for sure.
Thank you,
Justin. Yeah, you're welcome. Absolutely. Justin, it looks like you had a question. Would you like to ask on mic?
So one question I had is, earlier in the presentation, you kind of said something to me that was implied that, like, you have to be doing like the big research, the big sexy questions, things like that. And, that's how you get people's attention. So I feel like a lot of technical research is not big and sexy, right? Like a lot of it's very niche, in the weeds, like something that, like, unless you're in that field, you're not going to understand. So how do you take something that's very small and particular and make that into a bigger context when maybe it's not quite obvious, even to the researchers, how that's going to have like a effect down the road?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's highly contingent on the subject itself. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to that. But what I would say is, one, I think the way that you're crafting the presentation of it can intensify its allure. So sometimes we have to put lipstick on a pig, so to speak. Sometimes there are ways in which we can intensify the attraction of an idea by anticipating an audience's interest in it, or by saying this thing is super interesting and it's something that has caught the attention of a big audience. Let's take a look at this related thing. Or, I just think there are strategies in the telling of it that you can employ that will help you. I don't want to be disingenuous. I don't want to suggest that, you're making something of nothing. But I think there are really significant things about even small projects, projects with a small scope, and projects that might not seem that impactful, but that are. So I really think it's about how you shape the narrative and how you utilize those storytelling devices. And sometimes it's a little bit of luck. I had a great writing teacher once who said, all published books have a little bit of luck. And there's something to that, right? And that we don't want to hear that, that's a very disappointing thing to concede. But sometimes it is, you hit it at the right time and the right person sees it. There is that element, but really the thing that you can control is how you're presenting the information and how you're framing it and how you're talking about the larger implication of it. And I think with a lot of practice, you can really craft a captivating narrative, even about a small seeming piece of research or project.
Thank you, Austin. That was excellent presentation and gave me some insight into some of the work that I'm doing. I did ask this question in the chat box as well. There seems to be a need for us to understand what the reader already has perceived about what we're writing. And that in a group context can be quite challenging, particularly for technical work. Where do you put the focus, sort of, yeah. Hope you can give me some sort of guidance on that.
And just to make sure I'm understanding the question, like in a collaborative writing environment, how to sort of leverage these sorts of things.
Yeah, to get to the common ground of understanding.
Yeah, that can be a real struggle, right? Because the evolution of the project is unfolding for the individual, but it's also unfolding for the group. And then there's the dynamic that that's managed between those things. So it can be tough. Off the top of my head, I think sort of aligning expectations at the beginning of a project is a way to think about how you can sort of all move forward at a similar pace. And, even if it's just logistical expectations, like we're all gonna write this many pages of a draft, or, we're gonna equally split up the labor of the writing, or Sanjeev, like you really enjoy writing the opening section, so why don't you take that one and then I'll take this part. So I think setting expectations in the beginning can really help sort of set a pace that you can keep up with. And then I think it's often about like checking in with each other and making sure, so much of collaboration and collaborative writing is like checking in and saying, all right, this is where I'm at. Where are you at? Let me take your temperature on this. Let me try this out, and can you give me feedback? And that's another great thing about collaboration is the more feedback I think you can provide each other, and the more mechanisms for feedback that you create in the process, the easier it is to start to like sense where each other is moving within the project. So if you can say, you know, set a schedule and say, we'll give each other feedback in this form by this date, and we'll check in with each other, you know, by this day, and we'll make that weekly or monthly, or, you know, depending on the scope, whatever is appropriate for your timeline. So that's another strategy I think you can employ. And then I think too, it's just the give and take process of collaborative work and collaborative writing. Sometimes you have to be willing to make concessions. Sometimes you have to be willing to say, this, I really like the voice or the tone of this piece of writing, but I understand that the way it's being crafted by this collaborator is more appropriate or is more effective. And so I'll like align myself with that, even though I really love this piece. You know, we all sort of have to make those kinds of concessions. Writers often talk about murdering our darlings, by which we mean, you know, sort of saying, man, I love this sentence, but it doesn't work, so I got to throw it out. Sometimes you gotta make those sort of concessions, and you can always save your writing. You can always save drafts and come back to them later. If you have to sacrifice it, you don't have to sacrifice it forever. So those are the things that come to mind. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Wonderful.
For sure. Maybe we can take something from the chat or the Q&A if there's something appropriate in there. Haley pointed out a question from Daniel. Has employing a creative spin or a storytelling framework ever not been well received in a technical or white paper?
So I'm asking this from a DoD perspective. You know, I've seen a lot of white papers and a lot of technical papers, and every once in a while we get a contractor. I'll be honest, a contractor that comes in and they put a creative spin on it, and it reads fantastic, but it is not what, you know, the C-suite or the executive leadership want to see. And so I was wondering, you know, in your opinion, you know, is there a time and a place for creative spin and storytelling framework, or is it something that you feel the water out and kind of test, or if you use it appropriately, it's always effective?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, using it is always effective, but I'm biased, right? Like, of course, I'm going to tell you that because I'm a storyteller first. So I think it's a personal decision that you have to make. What I often tell writing students is, so I taught writing for many, many years in higher ed. And what I often told writing students is writing is always about the consequences of the choices we make. We make choices. Some of them, they're all consequential. Some of them produce, you know, really fantastic results, and some of them do not earn us the results we want, or they steer people away, and, you know, they get us negative results. And as you start to write more and develop the practice of writing, I think you start to just get a sense of anticipating the consequences of the decisions you make. And so you're always going to have agency as the writer. You're always going to be crafting the work. It's always going to be yours, and you always have the power to say, oh, this is appropriate, or I don't know, this is pushing it a little too far. But for me, even in a white paper, and I don't work for the DoD, but I've reviewed a lot of proposals, and I've edited a lot of white papers, and even for me, there's some opportunity for even just applying the concision challenge, like how succinctly can I say this? Even just challenging yourself in that respect, I think can be helpful.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We might have time for one more, if there's one more question.
I made some comments in the chat, so I kind of want to spark a dialogue really more than ask a question. This is kind of a follow-on to what Sanjeev and Daniel commented. Just being an engineer or a scientist, the trade seems to be, and I think they'll attest to this from being, anybody who's in the space will attest to this, is we want high reproducibility. It's like a factory mindset. I want to get this one thing that works, and then I want to reproduce it over and over again, and get it out the door. And creative works don't work like that. It's about authenticity and being present in the moment and things like that. So the question that arose was, do those things not work? And I think it's just a matter of building up a tolerance for that, because while it might not secure the huge contract, there's the idea that you can't be creative and be productive at the same time, that they're opposing things. They don't work together. And so it's been my experience that it's just it's something that's going to take time to just prove that, hey, you can have multi-billion-dollar profits and also be very creative and specialized and have this unique experience at the same time. But right now, the landscape, and feel free to chime in as you will, seems to be like mass reproducibility, uniform, cookie cutter, and then creativity when we get to it.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And that's one reason why super creative, well done proposals do stand out, is because they're in high relief, they're in high contrast to cookie cutter, so to speak, narratives that come in. So yeah, I think it's super well said. And there's always that negotiation between how we think about artistry and finally sort of crafting something, the craftspersonship of finely honed skills and a mass-produced product. But I'll just say, I know we're at time, but I'll just say there's always that negotiation. But developing a practice of writing as often as you can, and really developing a practice, making it habitual, is a great way to get faster at producing quality. So I will just put in a plug for getting into the chair, sitting at the desk, and making a habitual practice out of writing. It'll help at least address that. I know we're at time, and I hope y'all will continue this conversation, and please feel free, as I said, to reach out to me. I'm happy to continue the conversation with y'all as well. And thank you so much. Thank you to Haley, to Chris, and I just am so thankful for this opportunity to speak with y'all. It's been such a pleasure, and I hope we get to do it again sometime.
Thank you for an excellent presentation this evening, and thank you for participating in this webinar, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.